The story begins inside a royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly wakes up in a large, luxurious bed. When he raises his hands, he is immediately confused. His hands are small, thin, and clearly not those of an adult. At the same time, memories from another life begin to surface. He remembers living in Japan, spending his days packed into crowded trains, working endlessly, and returning home exhausted every night. His life back then was repetitive and empty. Realizing what has happened, Van understands that he has been reincarnated into another world. Van climbs out of bed and uses a small stool to look out the window. Outside, he sees wide land, tall buildings, and a peaceful sky. Before he can enjoy the view for long, his maid, Till, rushes in and panics, warning him that it is dangerous. When Van calmly apologizes using clear and polite words, Till freezes in shock. Van is supposed to be only 2 years old. Hearing himself speak, Van realizes that along with memories from his past life, he also has memories from this world. His name is Van Ne Ferdio, son of Marquis Jalpa Ferdio, ruler of this land. Later, Van sits down for breakfast with his father and brothers. The atmosphere is stiff and quiet. Jalpa asks his sons what they plan to study that day. Jard says he will focus on fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto says he will study magic. When Jalpa turns to Van, Van answers honestly, saying he wants to learn the nation's history and culture first. His answer shocks his brothers, but Jalpa laughs and praises Van's intelligence. He confidently states that Van will inherit powerful fire magic, just like his parents, and tells him to look forward to his magical aptitude test when he turns 8. Van soon learns that magic determines a person's value in this world. Fire, water, wind, and earth are considered noble elements, while all other magic types are treated as useless. After breakfast, Van begins studying the world's structure, races, and magic tools. However, things become intense when the strict head butler Espada takes over his education. Espada pushes Van into merciless study sessions from morning until night. Thanks to this harsh training, Van learns to read and write within weeks, though he often wonders how this is considered normal for a toddler. After 2 years of non-stop studying, Van turns 4 and begins sword training. At first, he is completely hopeless and loses repeatedly, even to the maids. Still, he refuses to quit and continues practicing every day. By the time he turns 5, his effort pays off. He starts defeating older trainees with ease, thanks to his calm thinking and experience from his past life. Unlike his brothers, Van treats commoners kindly, which earns him respect and friendship. During training, the deputy knight commander D examines Van's hands and notices that they lack calluses. He realizes that Van spends more time studying than training. D offers to speak to Espada, but instead decides to personally train Van himself. Unfortunately, D's idea of training is extreme, pushing Van to his physical limits with no mercy. Still, Van cannot deny that despite the pain, he feels fulfilled for the first time in his life. By the time Van turns 6, the endless routine of studying and training becomes exhausting. Wanting to actually enjoy life, Van decides to act like a normal child and asked to visit the market. The market is lively and full of people, and Van is fascinated by everything he sees. While exploring, he witnesses a shocking scene, a man selling his own son into slavery. Van learns that poor families often sell children they cannot support. When the man becomes violent after learning his son is worth very little, Van steps in and buys the boy for 5 silver coins. Van never planned to own him and told him he is free. However, since Kamsin has nowhere to go, Van registers him as his slave so he can safely bring him home. A slave contract is formed, leaving a mark on Kamsin's hand. Time passes, and Van finally reaches 8 years old, the age when magical aptitude is tested. Everyone expects him to awaken powerful elemental magic. Instead, the result leaves everyone stunned. Van possesses production magic, a type considered worthless. Furious, Jalpa nearly kill him on the spot. At the last moment, Van's eldest brother, Mercia, intervenes and suggests sending Van to govern a remote village instead. Jalpa agrees and orders Van to leave immediately. Though cast aside, Van feels hopeful about starting a new life. However, his hope quickly fades when Espada and Dee announce that they will accompany him. Van continues his journey toward his assigned territory in a carriage. To pass the time, he decides to experiment with his production magic. Concentrating his mana, he creates a small sword out of thin air. The process goes smoothly, showing that he already has excellent control over his magic. Kamsin watches quietly and is not surprised, as he already knows Van learns incredibly fast. During the ride, Van brings up an important issue. Since he has been disowned by his family and lost his noble status, he tells Kamsin that there is no longer any reason for him to remain a slave. Van offers to cancel the slave contract and help him live freely. However, Kamsin immediately refuses. He firmly declares that his life now belongs to Van and that he will follow him wherever he goes. Van is troubled by how serious Kamsin is, but accepts his decision. Suddenly, the carriage stops. Looking ahead, they see a village under attack. Dee quickly evaluates the situation and estimates around 50 enemies, likely bandits. He suggests attacking immediately. However, the adventurer Ortho objects, reminding everyone that their contract is only to escort Van, not fight a full battle. Dee becomes angry and insists he cannot abandon innocent villagers. Even if no one helps him, he is ready to fight alone. Before things escalate, Espada intervenes and bluntly calls Dee's plan reckless. Instead, Espada proposes a strategy using a defensive wall, ranged attacks, and a surprise flank assault. Van immediately notices the flaw in the plan. Espada would have to act as bait, putting his life at risk. Understanding how important Espada and Dee are to the future of the territory, Van volunteers to take the role himself. Till and Kamsin panic and strongly object, but Van calmly insists. He reminds them that he trained with the sword for years and believes this is something he must do. Van's resolve deeply affects Ortho, who recalled how politely Van thanked him earlier. Realizing Van is different from other nobles, Ortho steps forward and refuses to let a child risk his life. With that, the plan is revised. Espada raises the defensive wall, adventurers fire arrows from behind it, and Dee and Ortho's forces launch a coordinated attack from both sides. The bandits fall into chaos. During the battle, the bandit leader breaks through and charges towards the wall, but Van steps in and slashes his Achilles tendon. Kamsin immediately finishes the fight. The remaining bandits are captured and the village is saved, without civilian casualties. After the battle, most adventurers leave, but Ortho and his party decide to stay behind, impressed by Van's leadership and calm judgment. Van then formally introduces himself to the village chief, Rhonda, as their new lord. Rhonda explains that the village has suffered repeated attacks ever since night patrols stopped coming. Van apologizes for the neglect and promises to protect them. He presents 3 possible plans: creating valuable goods, hiring mercenaries, or strengthening the village's defenses. The villagers are unsure until Espada and Dee introduce themselves and reveal their positions. Hearing this greatly boosts morale. Van then shocks everyone by lowering the tax rate from 30% to 10%, prioritizing stability over profit. Espada constructs a temporary defensive wall, while the knights begin preparing a moat and traps. Van tests his production magic again, creating incredibly durable wooden blocks that cannot be damaged even by Ortho's sword. He continues producing weapons effortlessly and gifts Kamsin a sword, which Kamsin accepts with great gratitude. That night, Van notices everyone is exhausted from sleeping outdoors. Deciding that proper living conditions come first, he resolves to build a house. The next morning, Van analyzes the land and activates his production magic. In an instant, a massive mansion rises from the ground. Everyone is left completely speechless, as Van calmly wonders if he might have made it a little too big.
Villagers, still struggling to believe what they just witnessed, Van's production magic has already transformed the village, and Till is clearly excited, while Kamsin points out that this kind of magic is actually more suitable for a feudal lord than the 4 elemental magics. Van finds this interesting, but he admits that he still prefers offensive magic because it allows him to directly protect his people. When he asks whether they wouldn't feel safer under a lord like that, both Till and Khamsin immediately disagree. They say they would rather live under Van than under his father any day, which makes Van happy, even though he knows they might be biased. Espada then gives his own opinion. He explains that during wartime, Van's thinking would be correct, since defense is everything. But in peaceful times, people want a lord who improves their daily lives. In that sense, no one understands the villagers better than Van. Everyone agrees that Van's production magic is not only powerful, but also kind. Van then casually tells everyone that if they bring wood, he can build houses for them too. This shocks the adventurers and knights, who immediately rush off to gather materials. Soon after, the villagers also ask if their homes can be rebuilt, since their current homes are old, leaky, and barely standing. Van realizes rebuilding everything at once will be exhausting, but after seeing their living conditions, he decides to renovate the entire village first. Before long, the village is completely transformed. Old houses are replaced with clean, sturdy new ones, arranged in neat blocks with proper roads between them. Van intentionally makes all the houses identical to avoid inequality. The villagers are deeply grateful and bring him gifts in return. Van even builds simple public baths next to his mansion, mostly because he wants to bathe himself, but everyone ends up loving them. Water and heat are supplied using magic, and while some awkward moments almost happen, Van keeps things respectful. That night, Van finally relaxes after a long day. That night, Lady Panamera travels in a carriage with Arit, a small girl. Panamera gently teases and comforts her as they head toward a remote village. Soon after, work continues on strengthening the village defenses. A moat is completed, and Van suggests filling it with water for both defense and daily use. Espada diverts water from a nearby river, while the knights and soldiers help dig and reinforce the structure. Thanks to teamwork, the entire project is finished far faster than expected. The villagers celebrate as clean water finally flows into the village. Van doesn't stop there. He later orders the construction of a large wall surrounding the village, using fused earth and stone to create something as strong as concrete. He also installs defensive crossbows along the walls. What was once a poor settlement has now become a small fortress that bandits could never breach. While discussing the future, Espada reminds Van that defense alone isn't enough. The village needs steady income. Merchants only visit once a month, and food resources are limited. They begin brainstorming ideas for export goods, but most options are rejected because only Van can produce them. Later, Van learns that nearby mountains contain valuable minerals like iron, silver, gold, and even rare materials. This raises the possibility of a dungeon nearby, which could completely change the village's future. However, they decide to wait until the village is more stable before announcing anything. Van continues helping adventurers by crafting high-quality weapons from refined materials, shocking everyone with the speed and precision of his magic production. Despite using massive amounts of mana, Van shows no signs of magical exhaustion, though he admits his body still gets physically tired. Just as things seem calm, an alarm rings out. Armored lizard monsters are approaching the village. Van immediately orders the gates closed and the bridge raised. Seeing the fear on everyone's faces, Van steps forward and speaks clearly. He tells them that this fight will be dangerous and they could get hurt, but he will fight alongside them. However, he can't protect the village alone, and he asks everyone to stand with him. The villagers listen closely, realizing that their young lord is ready to risk his life for them. And that's how Episode 3 comes to an end. Subscribe to Recap Sama for more anime recaps like this one.